Kethavar stood at attention in the massive metal chamber that served as the High Command's briefing room. The walls were covered in displays showing star maps and battle reports from across the galaxy. His forearms were held perfectly still at his sides, as was proper for a Zelani officer receiving orders from his superiors. The commander looked down at him from the raised platform. Her scales were dark blue with age, and her eyes held the cold intelligence that had made the Zelani the most feared military force in known space. When she spoke, her voice echoed through the chamber like the sound of grinding metal. "Intelligence Officer Kethavar, you have been selected for a special assignment," she said. "The humans have applied to join the Terran Defense Coalition. Many species in the Galactic Council have concerns about these newcomers." Kethavar kept his expression neutral, though inside he felt confused. Humans were barely worth thinking about. They had only been traveling between stars for 200 years. Their technology was primitive compared to the Zelani's advanced weapons and ships. Most importantly, they had never won a significant battle against any major enemy. "Your mission is simple," the commander continued. "You will observe human forces in combat. The Ravak swarm is attacking their colony in the Kepler 442 system. This will give us a chance to see how humans fight when they are in real danger." The commander touched a control panel, and a holographic display appeared between them. It showed a small solar system with 3 planets. One of the planets was marked in red, indicating it was under attack. "The human colony has about 50,000 people," she explained. "The Ravak are attacking with a force 3 times larger than the human defense fleet. By all calculations, the humans should lose quickly and completely." Kethavar nodded. He had read about the Ravak in his studies. They were a species that used biological weapons and ships that could heal themselves. They were known for their brutal attacks and their ability to adapt to most defenses. If the humans were facing the Ravak, they would likely be defeated in a matter of days. "What exactly do you want me to observe?" Kethavar asked. "Everything," the commander replied. "How they fight, how they react under pressure, whether they maintain discipline when facing superior numbers. The Council needs to know if humans can be trusted as allies, or if they will simply panic and run when things get difficult." The commander handed him a data pad containing his mission details. "You will travel in the stealth ship Silent Observer. The humans will not know you are there. Document everything you see. Pay special attention to their command structure and their tactical decisions." Kethavar took the data pad and studied the information. The humans had a small fleet protecting the colony. 12 military ships and about 30 converted civilian vessels. The Ravak were bringing over 100 bioships, plus their feared biological weapons that could destroy entire populations. "With respect, Commander," Kethavar said, "this seems like it will be a very short observation mission. The humans are completely outmatched." The commander's lips pulled back slightly, showing her sharp teeth in what passed for a smile among the Zelani. "Perhaps, but the humans have survived on their homeworld for thousands of years, despite fighting constant wars against each other. They must have some survival instincts. We need to know what those instincts look like in space combat." She dismissed him with a wave of her hand. "Your ship is ready. You will leave immediately. Send reports every 12 hours until the battle is over." Kethavar left the briefing room and made his way to the docking bay where his ship was waiting. The Silent Observer was a sleek vessel designed for reconnaissance missions. It had the most advanced cloaking technology the Zelani had ever developed, making it completely invisible to most detection systems. As he walked through the ship's corridors, Kethavar thought about what he knew of humans. They were an odd species, according to the intelligence files. They seemed to make decisions based on emotions rather than logic. They formed attachments to other individuals that often made them act irrationally. Most strangely, they seemed to become more aggressive when they were losing rather than more cautious. The Zelani had studied many species over the centuries. Most followed predictable patterns in combat. When faced with superior numbers, they would either surrender, retreat, or try to negotiate. When their losses became too heavy, they would break and run. These were sensible responses that any intelligent species would use. But the human files contained stories that made no sense to Kethavar. There were reports of human soldiers continuing to fight even when they were badly wounded. Stories of humans attacking enemies much larger than themselves, sometimes winning through sheer determination. Most puzzling were the accounts of humans who seemed to become more dangerous as their situation became more hopeless. Kethavar settled into the pilot's chair and began the pre-flight sequence. The ship's engines hummed to life, and within minutes he was traveling through hyperspace toward the Kepler 442 system. The journey would take 3 days, which gave him time to study the files on both humans and the Ravak. The Ravak were well understood. They were a hive-minded species that used biological technology. Their ships were grown rather than built, and they could repair damage by consuming organic matter. They preferred to attack with overwhelming numbers, using fear and biological weapons to break their enemy's will to fight. The human files were much more confusing. Humans seemed to have no standard military doctrine. Different human commanders used completely different tactics, even when facing the same type of enemy. Some humans preferred direct attacks, others used elaborate tricks and deceptions. Some focused on protecting their people. Others seemed willing to sacrifice anything to achieve their goals. What worried Kethvar most was a note in the files about human berserker rage. Apparently, when humans became extremely angry or desperate, they could enter a mental state where they stopped caring about their own safety. In this state, they would attack any enemy regardless of the odds against them. This seemed like a serious flaw to Kethvar. A soldier who could not think clearly was a liability, not an asset. But the files suggested that humans in berserker rage were actually more dangerous than normal humans, not less. This made no sense according to any military theory Kethvar had studied. On the second day of his journey, Kethvar received an update from Zelani intelligence. The Ravak attack had begun. The human colony was sending out distress calls, asking for help from any nearby ships. So far, no other species had responded. The humans were truly on their own. When Kethvar's ship finally arrived at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, he immediately activated the cloaking device and began searching for the battle. It didn't take long to find. The space around the third planet was filled with ships, weapons fire, and the strange organic growths that marked Ravak biovessels. Kethvar positioned his ship at a safe distance and began recording everything. What he saw confirmed his expectations. The Ravak had brought a massive force, and the humans were clearly outmatched. The human ships looked small and fragile compared to the massive Ravak bioships, but as Kethvar watched the opening moves of the battle, he began to notice things that didn't match his predictions. The humans weren't running. They weren't trying to surrender. Instead, they were moving in patterns that seemed almost random, but somehow managed to avoid the worst of the Ravak attacks. Kethvar leaned forward in his chair, suddenly more interested in what he was seeing. Perhaps this observation mission would be more educational than he had expected. He began recording detailed notes, not knowing that what he was about to witness would change everything he thought he knew about warfare. Kethvar watched through his ship's sensors as the human defense fleet spread out across the space around their colony world. He had expected to see the neat formations that proper military forces used, with ships arranged in defensive lines and support vessels protected behind the main battle group. Instead, the humans scattered like frightened fish with no apparent pattern to their movements. The Ravak bioships moved forward in their typical attack formation. Kethvar had seen this pattern many times before in intelligence reports. The largest ships would advance first, soaking up enemy fire while smaller vessels flanked around the sides. It was an effective strategy that had broken dozens of species' defenses over the years. But the humans weren't defending the way they were supposed to. Instead of forming a defensive line, their ships kept moving in seemingly random directions. Some dove toward the planet's surface, others climbed high above the battle zone, and a few actually flew toward the advancing Ravak forces. Kethvar began recording his observations. Human tactical deployment appears chaotic and undisciplined, he spoke into his recording device. Ships are not maintaining formation. Command structure appears to have broken down before the battle has even begun. The first exchange of weapons fire confirmed Kethvar's expectations about human technology. The Ravak bioweapons tore through human shields like they weren't even there. Human weapons, while hitting their targets, seemed to barely scratch the thick biological armor of the Ravak ships. But then something happened that made Kethvar pause his recording. A human frigate, already badly damaged and leaking atmosphere, suddenly changed course and flew directly at one of the larger Ravak bioships. Kethvar assumed the human captain had lost control of his vessel, or perhaps had panicked and was trying to escape through the enemy formation. Instead, the human ship rammed directly into the Ravak vessel at full speed. The explosion was massive. Both ships were destroyed instantly, and the blast wave damaged several nearby Ravak vessels. Kethavar stared at the expanding cloud of debris, trying to understand what had just happened. Suicide attacks were sometimes used by desperate species, but they were considered a sign of military collapse, not tactical planning. Then he noticed something that made his scales tingle with unease. The other human ships had moved into new positions during the explosion. They were now attacking the damaged Ravak vessels with concentrated fire, destroying 2 of them before the Ravak could react. Kethavar replayed the battle footage, studying it more carefully. The human suicide attack hadn't been random or desperate. It had been perfectly timed to create a gap in the Ravak formation, and the other human ships had been ready to exploit that gap immediately. Correction to previous observation, Kethavar said into his recorder. Human tactical maneuver was intentional and coordinated. The sacrifice of one vessel was planned to create strategic advantage. As the battle continued, Kethavar began to notice other strange aspects of human combat behavior. Their communications channels were filled with sounds that his translator had difficulty interpreting. There were references to something called Earth history, and names like Kamikaze and Normandy that meant nothing to him. More disturbing were the emotional outbursts he could hear from human ship captains. They were laughing, shouting, and making what appeared to be jokes while their ships were being shot at. According to everything Kethavar knew about military discipline, this should have indicated that the human command structure was collapsing, but the humans kept fighting, with increasing effectiveness. A human captain whose ship had lost half its weapons and was venting atmosphere refused an offer to withdraw to safety. Instead, he used his damaged vessel as a decoy, drawing Ravak fire while other human ships flanked around and struck at vulnerable points. Another human commander deliberately flew her ship into a Ravak biological weapon cloud that should have killed everyone aboard. Instead of dying, the humans somehow used their ship's medical bay to develop a countermeasure to the weapon in real time, then transmitted the cure to the rest of their fleet. Kethavar found himself leaning forward in his chair, studying every detail of the human tactics. Nothing they were doing matched any military doctrine he had ever studied. They seemed to be making up new strategies as they fought, adapting to each Ravak attack with solutions that shouldn't have been possible. The most disturbing moment came when Kethavar intercepted a transmission between 2 human ship captains. One of them was badly wounded and his ship was failing. Instead of requesting rescue, he was asking the other captain to document his final attack run so that the next guys can learn from whatever I do wrong. The wounded captain then flew his dying ship directly into the largest Ravak bio-vessel. But instead of just ramming it, he somehow triggered a chain reaction in the alien ship's biological systems. The massive Ravak vessel began tearing itself apart from the inside. Its own healing systems turned against it. As the Ravak ship died, Kethavar heard the other human captain's voice over the radio. "Beautiful work, Mike. I got it all recorded. Command is going to love this new trick." Kethavar realized that the humans weren't just fighting a battle. They were treating each engagement as a learning experience. Every sacrifice, every desperate maneuver, every small victory was being studied and prepared for use by other human forces. The Ravak, for their part, seemed increasingly confused by human tactics. They were a hive-minded species, used to fighting opponents who followed predictable patterns. But humans appeared to have no standard patterns at all. Every human ship captain fought differently, making it impossible for the Ravak to adapt their usual strategies. As the first day of battle ended, Kethavar reviewed his recordings with growing unease. The humans had lost more ships than the Ravak, but they had also inflicted far more damage than should have been possible with their inferior technology. More importantly, they showed no signs of the demoralization that should have set in after taking such heavy losses. Instead, the surviving human forces seemed more determined than ever. Their communications were filled with references to their fallen comrades, but instead of grief, there was anger and a determination to make them pay for it. Kethavar prepared his first report to send back to High Command. As he wrote, he found himself struggling to find words that would adequately describe what he had witnessed. How could he explain that humans fought more effectively as their situation became more desperate? How could he describe tactics that seemed to violate every principle of rational warfare, yet somehow worked? He settled on a simple statement. Human military doctrine appears to be based on unpredictability and adaptation rather than established tactical principles. Initial assessment: humans may be more dangerous than previously estimated. After sending the report, Kethvar settled back in his chair to continue observing. The battle was far from over, and he had a feeling that what he had seen so far was only the beginning. The humans had surprised him once already. He wondered what other surprises they had in store for the Ravok forces. As he watched the human ships regrouping for the next day's fighting, Kethvar felt something he had never experienced before while observing a battle: uncertainty about who would ultimately win. The Ravok still had superior numbers and technology, but the humans had something else entirely. They had the ability to turn their own desperation into a weapon. On the second day of battle, Kethvar watched as the Ravok deployed their most feared weapon. The bioplague missiles launched from their largest ships, streaking toward the human colony world like deadly rain. These weapons had broken the will of every species the Ravok had ever used them against. The biological agents would spread across the planet's surface, causing horrific death and mutation among the population. Kethvar expected the humans to surrender immediately. Any rational species would negotiate rather than watch their civilians die in agony. He prepared to document the human surrender and the end of what had been a surprisingly interesting battle. Instead, the human response left him staring at his displays in complete confusion. The human colony began emergency evacuations, but not in the panicked way Kethvar had seen other species react to bioweapons. Instead, the evacuations were organized and systematic. Civilian ships launched from the planet in steady waves, each group protected by military escorts that fought off Ravok interceptors. But what shocked Kethvar most was that thousands of humans chose to stay behind on the infected world. Through intercepted communications, he learned that these volunteers included doctors, scientists, and engineers who were working to develop countermeasures to the bioplague. They were deliberately exposing themselves to the alien disease, testing experimental treatments on their own bodies while documenting the results for transmission to the rest of the human fleet. Kethvar had never heard of such a thing. What species would volunteer to die horribly in order to gather scientific data? What kind of military strategy involved using your own civilians as test subjects? The human admiral in charge of the fleet, a woman named Sarah Chen, sent a message to all human forces that made Kethvar's blood run cold. Every person who stays behind on the surface is a hero. Every piece of data they send us gets us closer to beating this thing. We will not let their sacrifice be meaningless. As the bioplague spread across the colony world, something impossible began to happen. The humans on the surface, working in makeshift laboratories while their world died around them, actually began making progress against the alien weapon. They identified the biological mechanisms of the plague. They developed partial treatments that slowed its effects. Most incredibly, they found ways to modify their own body chemistry to resist some of the weapon's worst effects. All of this information was transmitted to the human fleet, where military scientists began working on ways to weaponize their discoveries. If they could understand how the bioplague worked, they reasoned, they could find ways to turn it against the Ravok themselves. Kethvar watched a recording of Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, one of the human researchers on the planet's surface. She was clearly dying from the bioplague, her body showing the telltale signs of genetic breakdown that the weapon caused. But she continued working, her hands shaking as she typed her final report. The plague targets specific protein sequences, she said into her recording device, her voice weak but determined. If we can modify our ship's biofilters to produce these proteins artificially, we might be able to fool the Ravok sensors. They'll think we're infected when we're actually immune. She died 3 minutes after finishing her report, but her data allowed the human fleet to develop exactly the countermeasure she had described. By the third day of battle, human ships were flying directly through Ravok bioweapon clouds without taking damage. The Ravok, who had never encountered a species that could adapt to their plague so quickly, began to show signs of confusion and panic. But the humans weren't finished. They had learned something terrible about the bioweapons. The Ravok ships that carried them were vulnerable while the weapons were charging. The biological systems needed to concentrate energy for several minutes before firing, during which time their defensive capabilities were reduced. Human captains began using themselves as bait, flying damaged ships toward Ravok bioweapon platforms and allowing the aliens to target them. Then, just as the bioweapons were about to fire, other human ships would emerge from hiding and destroy the vulnerable Ravak vessels. Kethvar documented attack after attack where humans sacrificed themselves to create tactical advantages for their fleet. A human destroyer captain named James Rodriguez flew his burning ship directly at a Ravak command vessel, not to ram it, but to distract its defenses while human marines in boarding pods approached from the opposite direction. The boarding pods themselves were a shock to Kethvar. Most species used robotic systems for ship-to-ship boarding actions, since the casualty rates were so high. But humans sent living soldiers, armed with weapons that had been modified with technology reverse-engineered from captured Ravak bioships. The human marines didn't just board Ravak vessels to destroy them. They captured them, studying the alien technology while fighting off the ship's defenders. Then they would set the captured ships to explode, just as they were teleported back to their own vessels, taking valuable intelligence with them. One boarding action was recorded by a human marine's helmet camera. Kethvar watched as Sergeant Maria Santos led her squad through the twisting biological corridors of a Ravak bioship. The walls were covered in acidic slime that burned through their armor, and hostile organisms attacked them at every turn. But the humans adapted even to this. They used the Ravak ship's own biological systems against it, introducing modified bacteria that caused the ship's healing systems to malfunction. They turned the ship's defensive organisms into weapons by modifying their genetic codes with portable field equipment. "This is actually kind of fun," Sergeant Santos said over her radio, as she reprogrammed a Ravak bioturret to fire on its own ship. "It's like the galaxy's most dangerous biology class." She and her squad died when the ship exploded, but not before transmitting detailed specifications of Ravak biotechnology back to the human fleet. Within hours, human engineers were building weapons that used modified Ravak organisms against their creators. The most disturbing moment came when Kethvar intercepted a communication between Admiral Chen and the human colony's governor. The governor was reporting that the bioplague had killed nearly everyone who remained on the planet's surface, but the survivors had completed their research. "We figured out how to reverse engineer the plague," the governor said, his voice weak but triumphant. "We can modify it to target Ravak biology instead of human, but we need a delivery system." Admiral Chen's response sent chills through Kethvar's body. "Don't worry about delivery. We've learned a lot about Ravak ships over the past few days. We know how to get inside them." The next human attack was unlike anything Kethvar had ever seen. Human volunteers infected themselves with the modified bioplague, then allowed themselves to be captured by Ravak boarding parties. The aliens, thinking they had taken prisoners, brought the infected humans aboard their ships. The modified plague spread through the Ravak bioships like wildfire, causing their living systems to attack themselves. Within hours, dozens of Ravak vessels were dying from their own biological weapons, turned against them by human ingenuity and sacrifice. As the third day of battle ended, Kethvar realized that the tide had completely turned. The Ravak, who had begun the fight with overwhelming superiority, were now losing ships faster than they could replace them. Their bioweapons, their greatest advantage, had become a liability. But what terrified Kethvar most was the realization that this wasn't just a battle anymore. The humans had turned it into a comprehensive research project. Every Ravak tactic, every alien weapon, every biological system was being studied, cataloged, and reverse-engineered. The humans weren't just fighting to save their colony. They were learning everything they could about Ravak technology, so they could use it to protect other human worlds. They had turned their desperate defense into an intelligence-gathering operation that would benefit all of humanity. Kethvar prepared his second report to High Command, his hands shaking as he wrote. How could he explain that humans treated warfare like a science experiment? How could he describe a species that could turn their own deaths into weapons against their enemies? He looked out at the battle still raging around the human colony and realized something that made his blood freeze. If humans could do this to the Ravak, what could they do to the Zalani? By the fourth day of battle, Kethvar no longer recognized what he was watching as warfare. The humans had transformed their desperate defense into something that defied every military principle he had ever learned. What should have been their defeat had become a systematic dismantling of Ravak forces that was both brilliant and terrifying. The human fleet, now reinforced by ships built with captured Ravok biotechnology, launched what Admiral Chen called Operation Teaching Moment. The name itself confused Kethvar until he realized what the humans were actually doing. They were using the battle as an educational exercise for their entire species. Every human ship was recording everything. Every tactic the Ravok used was being analyzed and documented. Every weakness discovered was immediately shared with the entire human fleet and transmitted back to Earth for other human colonies to study. The Ravok weren't just fighting a human defense force, they were providing training data for the entire human military. But the humans weren't content to simply learn from their enemies. They had begun actively experimenting with new forms of warfare that made Kethvar's scales crawl with horror. A human captain named David Park had turned his damaged cruiser into a mobile laboratory. Instead of withdrawing for repairs, he flew directly into the densest part of the Ravok formation and began conducting what he called live fire research. His ship would attach itself to Ravok biovessels like a parasite, drilling into their living hulls to extract samples while the aliens tried desperately to shake them off. The key thing about Ravok bioships, Captain Park explained over an open communication channel, apparently unconcerned that the enemy might be listening, is that they're basically giant organisms, which means they have immune systems we can trick, nervous systems we can disrupt, and vital organs we can target. His ship was eventually destroyed by concentrated Ravok fire, but not before he had transmitted detailed biological analyses of 12 different Ravok vessel types. Within hours, human weapons were being modified to target the specific vulnerabilities he had discovered. The psychological warfare aspect was perhaps even more disturbing. The humans had begun broadcasting messages directly to Ravok forces, and what they were saying made no sense to Kethvar's understanding of military communications. Instead of threats or demands for surrender, the humans were telling jokes. They shared stories about their own deaths, laughed about their wounds, and made light of situations that should have terrified any rational being. One recording that particularly disturbed Kethvar was from a human pilot whose ship was being torn apart by Ravok bioweapons. "Hey, guys," the pilot said cheerfully as his cockpit filled with toxic gas. "Turns out these bioclouds actually smell kind of like my grandmother's cooking, which explains why I'm dying, because her cooking was terrible." He laughed at his own joke even as the alien toxins shut down his body systems. The effect on Ravok morale was devastating. How could a hive-minded species understand enemies who treated death as a source of humor? The Ravok had evolved to break their opponent's will through fear and suffering, but humans seemed to get stronger and more determined the worse their situation became. The turning point came when the Ravok deployed their planet cracker weapon. This was their ultimate device, a massive biomechanical construct that could literally tear worlds apart. It was supposed to be their final answer to any resistance, surrender, or watch your planet die. Kethvar expected the humans to finally break. No species could watch their homeworld being destroyed and continue fighting. The rational response would be immediate surrender, followed by negotiations for the survival of the remaining population. Instead, Admiral Chen's response to the planet cracker deployment was broadcast on all frequencies. "You want to see what humans do when you threaten our homes? You're about to find out why we're the species that conquered our own planet before we learned to get along with each other." What followed was the most terrifying display of coordinated insanity Kethvar had ever witnessed. Every remaining human ship, including vessels so damaged they could barely maintain life support, launched a simultaneous attack on the Ravok planet cracker. The attack wasn't designed to destroy the weapon. It was designed to capture it. Human boarding parties equipped with biosuits reverse-engineered from Ravok technology swarmed over the massive device. They didn't try to shut it down. Instead, they began reprogramming it while it was still charging to fire on their own world. Kethvar watched in horrified fascination as human engineers worked on the planet crackers controls while Ravok defenders tried to stop them. The humans had somehow figured out how to interface with Ravok biotechnology using their own nervous systems, literally plugging themselves into alien machines to control them. The lead engineer, a woman named Dr. Rachel Kim, was being eaten alive by Ravok defensive organisms as she worked. Her body was breaking down at the cellular level, but she continued reprogramming the planet cracker's targeting systems with her dying thoughts. Almost got it, she said over the radio, her voice distorted by the biological corruption spreading through her body. Just need to flip the target coordinates and there. Instead of cracking our planet, this thing is now going to crack theirs. She died 3 seconds later, but her modification held. The planet cracker fired, but instead of destroying the human colony world, it tore apart the Ravok command ship and half their remaining fleet. But the humans weren't finished. Having learned how to control Ravok biotechnology, they began turning the aliens' own ships against them. Human technicians working with captured Ravok organisms developed computer viruses that could infect biological systems. These viruses spread from ship to ship through the Ravok's own communication networks, causing their vessels to malfunction, attack each other, or simply shut down. The Ravok found themselves fighting not just human ships, but their own technology that had been turned against them. The final phase of the battle was less a military engagement than a demonstration of human adaptability. Small teams of human soldiers, now wearing biosuits that made them look like Ravok creatures, infiltrated the remaining alien ships and systematically captured or destroyed them from within. Kethavar recorded the last transmission from the Ravok fleet commander, a desperate plea for reinforcements that revealed the aliens' complete psychological breakdown. These creatures are not normal. They learn from everything. They turn our own weapons against us. They fight harder when they're dying. This is not warfare, this is madness. The plea was cut short when human infiltrators reached the Ravok command center and disabled their communication systems. The remaining Ravok ships, cut off from their command structure and infected with human bioviruses, began retreating from the system in complete disorder. As Kethavar watched the Ravok fleet flee, he realized that what he had witnessed wasn't just a human victory, it was a comprehensive intelligence operation disguised as a defensive battle. The humans had intentionally prolonged the fight to learn everything they could about Ravok technology, tactics, and weaknesses. Every human death had been documented and analyzed. Every Ravok weapon had been studied and reverse-engineered. Every alien tactic had been cataloged and prepared for distribution to other human military units throughout their territory. The humans hadn't just defeated the Ravok. They had turned them into unwilling teachers in a massive educational program that would benefit all of humanity's future military operations. Admiral Chen's final transmission to her fleet confirmed Kethavar's worst fears. Outstanding work, everyone. We've learned more about biowarfare in the past 4 days than our species has known in 2 centuries. All data is being transmitted to Earth Command for integration into our standard military doctrine. The next time any human colony faces bioweapons, we'll be ready. Kethavar stared at his recording equipment, trying to comprehend what he had just witnessed. The humans had suffered terrible losses. Their colony world was partially destroyed, and their defense fleet was reduced to a fraction of its original size. By any rational measure, this should have been a defeat that would discourage other human colonies from resisting alien attacks. Instead, it had become a victory that would make every human settlement in the galaxy more dangerous to attack. As he began preparing his report to High Command, Kethavar realized that his mission had revealed something far more important than human military capabilities. It had shown him that humanity represented a completely new type of threat, an enemy that became more dangerous every time you fought them. The battle was over. The Ravok fleet had fled the system in complete disarray, leaving behind only debris and the bitter lesson that they had severely underestimated their opponents. Kethavar sat in his observation ship staring at the tactical displays that showed the aftermath of what should have been a simple colonial defense. The human cost had been staggering. 60% of their defense fleet was destroyed or severely damaged. Their colony world was scarred by bioweapons and partially depopulated. By any conventional military analysis, this was a Pyrrhic victory at best, the kind of costly win that should discourage future resistance. But as Kethavar monitored human communications, he realized that the survivors were already planning their next moves. They weren't mourning their losses or questioning whether the fight had been worth it. Instead, they were discussing how to apply what they had learned to defend other human colonies. Admiral Chen was coordinating with Earth Command, transmitting detailed reports on Ravok technology and tactics. Human engineers were already designing new weapons based on captured alien biotechnology. Most disturbing of all, human colonists were volunteering to help establish new defensive strategies on other worlds. Despite having just survived one of the most brutal battles in recent galactic history, the colony is requesting immediate resupply and reinforcement, Admiral Chen reported to Earth Command. We have enough data on Ravak bioweapons to develop comprehensive countermeasures. Recommend immediate distribution to all human military units and colonial defense forces. Kethvar found himself staring at his final report, struggling to find words that could adequately convey what he had witnessed. How could he explain to the High Command that humans had turned a desperate last stand into a comprehensive intelligence operation? How could he describe a species that treated their own casualties as acceptable losses in exchange for military knowledge? The strategic implications were terrifying. The Ravak had been one of the galaxy's most feared military forces, known for their bioweapons and their ability to break enemy morale through psychological warfare. In 4 days, humans had not only defeated them but had also captured enough of their technology to potentially reverse engineer their entire military doctrine. But what truly horrified Kethvar was his growing understanding of how humans approached warfare in general. Through intercepted communications and battlefield observations, he had learned that this battle was not unique. Humans had been fighting each other for thousands of years before they reached space, and they had developed a military philosophy that was completely alien to every other known species. Where other species fought to win with minimal losses, humans fought to learn. Where other species avoided unnecessary risks, humans deliberately sought out dangerous situations that would teach them new tactics. Where other species tried to end conflicts quickly, humans were willing to prolong battles if it meant gaining valuable experience. The implications for the Zilani Confederacy were devastating. Kethavar's own species had built their military reputation on technological superiority and disciplined tactics. They used overwhelming force and logical strategic planning to achieve quick, decisive victories with minimal casualties. But everything he had observed suggested that human chaos tactics would be perfectly designed to counter Zilani military doctrine. Human unpredictability would neutralize Zilani planning. Human adaptability would overcome Zilani technological advantages. Most terrifyingly, human willingness to accept casualties would eventually wear down Zilani forces that were designed for quick, efficient victories. Kethvar began typing his final report, knowing that every word would change how the galactic community viewed humanity. Strategic assessment, human military capabilities. Human species represents a fundamentally different approach to warfare than any previously encountered. Their military doctrine appears to be based on the following principles. Adaptability over standardization. Human forces modify their tactics in real time based on enemy actions. No two human military units fight in exactly the same way. Learning over winning. Humans appear willing to accept tactical defeats if they result in strategic knowledge that can be applied to future conflicts. Escalation over de-escalation. Human forces become more effective as their situation becomes more desperate, contrary to all known military psychology. Integration over specialization. Humans rapidly adopt and modify enemy technology, often using it more effectively than its creators. Sacrifice over preservation. Individual human units will accept certain destruction to achieve objectives that benefit the larger force. Conclusion. The human species should be considered a Class Alpha strategic threat, not because of their current military capabilities, but because of their potential for rapid military evolution. Any prolonged conflict with humans would likely result in them becoming significantly more dangerous than they were at the beginning of the conflict. Recommendation. The Zilani Confederacy should avoid direct military confrontation with human forces under all circumstances. If cooperation with humans is necessary, it should be conducted from a position of diplomatic equality, not military superiority. Kethvar paused before adding his personal assessment, knowing it would likely end his career in military intelligence. Personal observation. I was assigned to determine whether humans could be effective military allies. Instead, I have concluded that they may represent the most dangerous military force in the galaxy, not because of their technology or their numbers, but because they approach warfare as an educational process rather than a method of conquest. Every battle teaches them new tactics. Every defeat shows them new strategies. Every enemy provides them with new technology to adapt and improve. In essence, humans become more dangerous every time someone fights them. The galaxy has operated under the assumption that rational military doctrine would always prevail over emotional chaos. Humanity has proven this assumption incorrect. They have weaponized their own unpredictability and turned their apparent weakness into their greatest strength. Can only hope that they consider us valuable enough to keep as allies rather than obstacles to be studied and overcome. HFY sealed his report and prepared to transmit it to High Command. But before sending it, he made a personal decision that violated every protocol of military intelligence. He sent a copy to the human admiral, who had coordinated the defense of the colony. Admiral Chen's response came within an hour. "Thank you for the tactical analysis, Observer HFY. Your observations have been quite helpful in understanding how other species view our military doctrine. We'd be happy to discuss potential cooperation between our forces, assuming your superiors are interested in peaceful relations." The message included detailed specifications for several Zilani military technologies that should have been classified beyond human reach. Somehow, during their observation of human tactics, the humans had been observing them right back. HFY realized that his cloaked ship had never been as invisible as he had thought. The humans had known he was there from the beginning, and they had allowed him to document their capabilities because they wanted the galactic community to understand exactly what humanity was capable of. The battle for the human colony hadn't been a desperate last stand. It had been a demonstration, carefully orchestrated to show any potential enemies what they would face if they threatened human worlds. As HFY set course for Zilani space, he found himself hoping that his people would choose diplomacy over conflict when they learned what he had discovered, because after watching humans fight, he knew that any species that chose to become their enemy would face an opponent that learned from every engagement and became stronger with every battle. The last entry in his personal log reflected the regret that had given his mission its meaning. "I was sent to observe human military capabilities and determine their value as potential allies. Instead, I have learned that the real question is not whether humans can help us in our conflicts, but whether we can avoid becoming their enemies." The galaxy assumed that chaos and emotion were weaknesses in warfare. Humanity has proven that assumption wrong. They have turned their apparent disadvantages into weapons that can defeat any rational military doctrine. I regret ever accepting this assignment, not because of what I witnessed, but because of what I now understand about the future of galactic warfare. The age of predictable, rational conflict is ending. The age of human military innovation has begun, and I fear that very few species are prepared for what that means.